The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $65, and the biggest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole county. Harlan Voss did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked at the thing he had bought. A massive, round bank vault door, tall and broad as a doorway and thick as a man's hand is long. A great circular slab of steel lying half sunk in the weeds at the edge of the lot, the rust run down its face in long streaks, the combination dial seized solid, and the spoke handle frozen, and the heavy boltwork rusted shut, so that there was no opening it, no give, nothing but the better part of a ton of dead steel 4 strong men could not roll to a truck. A ruined vault door worth nothing, that a torch would only scar, that 40 grown people had walked past all morning, and that Harlan Voss had just paid $65 to own. It was a warm, bright Saturday morning, the 9th of June, 1973, at the farm and salvage auction on the old Mercer place at the edge of Dry Fork in Calder County, Missouri. Harlan was 70 years old, lean and straight through the back from a lifetime of close and careful work, just beginning to stoop, with a deeply lined face burned brown by the weather, short white hair under a flat tweed cap, and pale, steady eyes that did not move fast. His hands were broad and thick at the knuckle, a man's hands that had both feathered a tumbler opened by sound and swung a half-ton door true on its hinges. Harlan Voss had set and opened locks and bank vaults for 50 years, the man they called from 3 counties over when a dial froze, or a time lock hung, or a door would not come true in its frame. It was the kind of lot that comes after a place is broken up. The old Mercer farm on Dry Fork had gone back to the bank and sat empty, the family scattered and gone. And that spring the holdings were sold off to settle what was owed. Most of it was farm iron and machinery. But the vault door was the odd thing on the place. It had not come off any farm at all. Old Mercer had bought it for scrap years back, when the little Dry Fork bank in town was torn down, and it had lain in the weeds behind his machine shed so long the grass had grown up through the spokes of the handle. So they dragged it out and stood it up at the edge of the last row, looking like the most hopeless thing on the place. The man who laughed was Dale Furman, who ran the biggest scrap and salvage outfit between the river and the county line. A heavy-set man of 52 in a loud red checked shirt and a wide pale cap, his face clean-shaven and ruddy, a silver buckle the size of a saucer at his belt. $65, Dale said, loud, so the people along the rope could hear it. $65 for a rusted shut-hunk you'd need a record to load and a torch to ruin. Old-timer, that dial froze before either of us was born. You can't crack it, can't sell it, can't even tip it on a wagon. You just bought the heaviest manhole cover in Calder County, only it don't lay flat. He coined the name right there, and it stuck to Harlan for the rest of that June. The wheel. The people laughed because Dale laughed, the way a crowd does. Harlan stood through it without a change in his face, one broad hand flat on the cold rust-streaked steel, and let the laughter wash over him and pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world used when it was stuck and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about. And you might take a second to subscribe, because the people who stay for stories like Harlan's are exactly who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Harlan said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What none of them knew What Dale Furman could not have known, grinning in his good cap, was that Harlan had walked the rows an hour before the sale and stopped dead at that door, and his whole trade had risen up in him. The crowd saw a ruined hunk of iron. Harlan saw the work. He had laid his hand flat on the steel and read it the way a vault man reads another man's vault, and the door was no plain scrap slab. It was a proper bank vault door, a deep boltwork door with a fine geared dial, the kind a bank buys once and trusts for a lifetime. And the dial had not been drilled, the door had not been peeled, the steel ran whole and unmarked, which meant somebody had spun that dial shut and thrown those bolts on purpose, and whatever was behind the door was behind it still. Harlan would have it open before the night was out, and what he found would change how the whole county remembered a dead man and a failed bank both. Harlan had come up hard. He was born in 1903 and went to work at 14 for a locksmith in the city, learning to file a key blank and feel a tumbler drop before he learned much else. An old safe man took him on for his patient hands and his good ear, and across the years he made himself into a vault man of the rare kind, the one a bank called when a time lock hung on a Monday with the payroll shut inside, who could lay a hand on a door and feel through the steel what was wrong with it. He carried the trade through the hard years when half the little banks in the state went under, and it opened the locked-up ruins of more failed banks than he cared to count. His wife Ada had died after a long illness, and they had laid a grown son in the ground from the war before that, and after Ada was gone, he lived alone at the edge of town with his tools and his quiet. The county had a use for his hands and no use at all for his opinion. He knew that. He bought the door anyway. He bought it because he could read it. To a man who had spent 50 years on bank vaults, that frozen door told a story the crowd could not hear. He knew the little Dry Fork bank it had come out of, a country bank that had failed in the bad years and never opened again. The building shut and dark a long time and finally pulled down. And he knew the thing the rest of them had forgotten, that a door like this had its own steel compartment built into the back of it, a shallow-lined cavity behind the boltwork plate where the men who ran the bank kept the things that could not be left on an open shelf. And the door had been sealed by a careful hand and never forced. He could not yet have told you what was in it, but a man does not stay 50 years in the trade by ignoring what his own hands are telling him plain. If you've made it this far into Harlan's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the machinery and the farm iron, and he waited. When the auctioneer finally got to the vault door and asked $5 to start it, the crowd laughed. Dale called out his joke about the wheel, and not one other hand went up. Harlan raised one finger, and the gavel came down at 65. It took both auction helpers and a chain hoist rigged off a borrowed wrecker to wrestle the better part of a ton of steel up onto a flatbed. And Harlan drove the 11 miles home at 20 miles an hour and did not hurry. There is a kind of patience that looks like slowness right up until the moment it doesn't, and Harlan Voss had a whole lifetime of it riding in the cab with him. The story got around Calder County before Harlan's flatbed was off the Mercer Road. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the feed store to ask, grinning, how the wheel was rolling. Merle Apgar, who ran the grain elevator, said it plainer than the rest, that there was nothing behind a failed bank door but cobwebs and an empty hole. Harlan was buying a tin of penetrating oil and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent 50 years learning that a thing is either built true or it isn't, and that the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which. But Harlan did not crack it open the night he brought it home. For the better part of a week, the door lay braced on heavy blocks on the floor of his back shop, and every evening after supper he gave it an hour, learning the thing before he laid a tool to it, washing the weeds and old grease off the steel, cleaning the dial and the boltwork under a strong lamp, listening, sounding. While down at the diner they laughed and asked if he'd gotten his wheel to spin yet. The little Dry Fork Bank had stood on the town square the better part of 40 years, and the county had let its memory go with a short, bitter judgment. The judgment was that the last cashier, a careful old man named Emmett Garrick, had run the bank into the ground. The man who stayed on alone after the directors scattered, who they said had let the deposits go and shut the doors one morning with the township's savings gone, grown strange and close in his last years, and died not long after with the bank broke and the building dark for good. The talk was that he had soured so hard his grown daughter Lena, married out and moved off, rarely came, and that he had died alone with nothing to show for 40 years of keeping its books. Harlan had known Emmett a little, as one careful workman knows another, and had once been into that very vault to free a hung lock and seen the back of this door, the lined compartment behind the plate. Harlan had never thought Emmett a thief or a fool. He had thought him a man carrying a weight he would not set down in front of anybody. What none of the rest of them ever asked was what an honest old cashier might do the morning a bank fails, with the one account he could not bear to let the failure swallow. The answer had been sealed in the back of that door the whole time, behind boltwork too heavy to steal and too plain to wonder at. When he had studied it long enough, the 6th evening, the lamp set so the light fell square across the dial, Harlan pulled up a stool and sat down in front of the door the way another man might sit down across from somebody he had a long talk waiting with. He had sounded every inch of it by then. The bolts rang solid and the plate rang true. No peel, no drill, no break anywhere in the steel. The dial spindle ran unmarked and the door face was whole, which meant somebody had spun the combination home, thrown the bolts, and let the rust freeze it so no one would ever trouble to open it again. Something in his chest went very quiet and very sure. A man does not seal a door this careful and walk away from it to keep nothing behind it. He went at the boltwork first, slow, with a respect one craftsman gives the hand that built another's work. He worked penetrating oil into the dial spindle and along the bolt carriage 3 evenings running, until the rust began to let go its grip a grain at a time. Then he turned to the dial. He could not know the combination, but a vault man who has feathered 10,000 locks does not always need it. He set his fingertips light on the dial and his ear close to the door and turned it slow, feeling for the small drops of the wheels through the steel, reading the door the way the old safe man had taught him to read the ones whose numbers were lost. The cold lived in his old knuckles like weather, but his hands did not shake, because a man who has done close and careful work 10,000 times does it long after the rest of him has gotten old. He drifted the seized bolts back one at a time, easing the carriage so as not to mar the works, and read the free dial down through its drops, patient, listening, until a little before 11 the last wheel fell into line under his fingers. With a small, sure click he felt more than heard. Harlan set both broad hands on the cold spoke handle, and the great round door of a vault the whole county had buried as a rusted wheel turned at last on its heavy hinges and swung open, slow and ponderous, into the lamplight. The compartment in the back of the door was deep and dry and dark, lined in old felt against the damp, and it was not empty. Packed careful and square inside, wrapped against the ears, was everything a faithful man had sealed away on the worst morning of a dying bank, sitting whole where no run and no creditor would ever reach it. Harlan stood with his hand on the open door and looked into the back of a $65 vault the township had laughed at as a wheel. He took the things out one at a time under the lamp, handling each like something another man had trusted to the dark for years. There were 3 kinds of things sealed in that door. The first was the money. Not flung in loose, but a careful man's whole keeping, wrapped against the damp in oilcloth, banded bills of the old large-size kind, a great many of them. And beneath them a heavy cloth roll that clinked when he lifted it, gold coin, double eagles and half eagles, set aside one at a time across whatever good years there were. And under that a paper tube of silver, worn smooth. Harlan was no appraiser, but he had handled enough hard money to know he was looking at far more than the whole Mercer auction had brought that morning, and the gold alone, in 1973, was worth a great deal past the face stamped on it. The second thing was the papers, sealed flat in a stiff oilcloth folder. A single deposit passbook kept apart from all the rest, the account of one depositor set down honest in a small square hand, a sheaf of the bank's own unredeemed certificates, and a thick hand-kept ledger, the pages ruled in that same square hand, not the bank's failed books at all, but a private reckoning, one man's account of what was owed, and to whom, when the doors came shut, every dollar set down against the name it belonged to. Folded in with the ledger, in that same hard hand, was a single sheet headed for Lena and the rest. Harlan set that sheet aside unread for the moment, because it felt like a thing a stranger ought to come to last. The third thing was the letter. One folded page, sealed in its own envelope and set upright at the front of the compartment where a man would see it first when the door came open, and on the outside, in that same hard square hand, it said only, "To whoever opens this, if my Lena cannot." Harlan worked the envelope open and read what a dead man had written for whoever reached it. Emmett Garrick wrote that he had stayed on as cashier after the directors ran and the bank could not be saved. The last man at the counter of a bank the bad years had already killed, and had watched it fail under honest people who had trusted their savings to it. He could not make the whole bank good, no one could. But there had been one account he would not let the failure swallow, the lifetime savings of a hard-working widow of the township, money she could not spare to lose, money the law would have paid out at pennies on the dollar if it paid at all. So he had made it good himself. The only way one man could, he set aside her whole sum in coin and silver and his own keeping with it, and sealed it in the one place in that bank a run or a creditor could never reach, the back of the vault door itself, meaning to put it into her hands quietly when the worst was over. He took sick and died before the worst was ever over, and the door went to scrap with the building. And the keeping went into the weeds with it. He had let the town call him the man who ruined the bank, he wrote, because a sealed door keeps its secret best behind a sour name. He asked, plain, that the widow's savings be carried to her or her people and made good as he had meant, and the rest go to his daughter Lena, who he had been too proud and too ashamed to tell while he lived. Below his name he had written it out, "Tell her I never robbed a soul." I sealed it so the bank's last honest debt would still get paid even after the doors were shut. Harlan read it twice through, and the only man in Calder County who had ever thought Emmett Garrick was carrying something now held the proof of it in two hands. Harlan did the only thing a man like Harlan would do. The next morning he went to the county and asked who had handled the Dry Fork Bank's affairs, and over the better part of a month they traced the widow's people and Emmett's daughter Lena both, and put into a lawyer's hands what had come out of a $65 door, every coin and the private ledger entire. Harlan did not keep a cent of it, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. A thing asked for plain ought to be honored. The widow Emmett had meant to make good had died some years before, but her grown people still farmed out past the river, and when the lawyer counted out the savings their mother had buried, believing it lost in the crash, they sat a long while and could not speak. And Lena Garrick Hale came to Dry Fork on a gray morning that July, a careworn woman of about 47, her brown hair going gray. And when the lawyer laid her father's letter and his private ledger on the table and she read them through, she put one hand flat over her mouth and her eyes filled, and she did not say anything for a long time. She had buried her father believing the county's story, and worse, her own, that he had let the bank and himself fall to nothing and shut her out for it. And the letter told her instead that the failure had been a face he wore on purpose to carry one last honest debt through to the other side of a thing that had killed everything else. She asked to meet the man who had opened it, and Harlan came to the lawyer's door in his shirt sleeves and stood there plain while she thanked him with her voice shaking. And all he said was that her father had sealed it the way a man seals a thing he means to last, and that things sealed that careful generally do. That summer the widow's savings went into her people's hands at last, made good to the dollar, and not one person in the county ever again called Emmett Garrick the man who ruined the bank. Word of it went around Calder County the same way the laughter had, only quieter, and the people who had called Harlan a fool let the name wheel drop and did not pick it up again. Dale Furman was not run out of the county and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he did not understand. And the next time he held court at the diner the others did not lean in so far. Harlan never said a word against him. Being right was the whole of what he had wanted, and being right had brought a decent dead man's name back up out of the dirt, and an honest debt to its rightful hands, which is more than it usually does. Lena kept the door. She would not have it scrapped or cut up. She had Harlan free the rust from the hinges and set the great door upright and true so it would swing clean and seal again the way her father had left it. And she stood it in the front room of her own house and told her grown family, who would keep it after her, that the rust on the outside was what the hard years had made of her father. And what he had sealed on the inside was what he had been the whole time underneath. And on a still evening that next summer, the light going gold across the open country, Harlan Voss drove out to look in on her, and there, in the last of the sun, stood the great round vault door, whole and sound and shut again. The dial spun home. Harlan was 70 years old, a man the county had laughed at one whole June, and he stood quiet a long moment and laid one broad, careful hand flat on the cool steel and nodded once, the way a man nods at a job that was done right. The work had set it for him the way work always did. A man seals the door shut so the last honest debt will still get paid for the ones who come after. even when he cannot say so himself, and the world rarely knows what was carried through the hard years until somebody troubles to open what no one else would. So I'll leave it to you. Was Harlan Voss right to hand back every dollar of it without keeping a cent for himself, or was that one decency too far, in a world that had laughed at him for nothing? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.